met in a bar on Mercer Street, and I have to say I was dismayed at the state of him. In 6 weeks, the man had turned into a husk, no flesh on his bones at all. I subdued the gust of irritation his appearance provoked in me, and aroused the familiar dull wave of rising concern. We sat at an obscure table at the back of the bar. He took off his glasses, and I saw in his eyes what I can only call an extinction of the spirit, and I strongly suspected it had to do with something other than grief. I waited for him to speak. He played with his cigarette. There was a trembling in the yellowed fingers as he lifted his drink to his lips. He tipped back the vodka in one movement. "What's the problem, Jack?" He said something about not being able to eat, or sleep, or work, or think properly anymore. "Why not?" He flung a look at me, then turned his head away. I knew the gesture well. He'd mastered it years ago. It was meant to suggest depths of torment no average mortal could be expected to comprehend, such sentiment being reserved for a certain few select noble souls. It had intimidated me once. "You're not using needles, are you?" For a moment he looked as though he'd rise from his chair in a towering rage and sweep out into the night to do more damage to himself because nobody understood him. He was nearly 40 years old, but he hadn't the juice in him to make such an exit. A bit of a sigh, sardonic and private, and he rubbed his face. I wondered if he wanted money, if that's what this was all about. I paid his rent and gave him an allowance. This we had organised immediately on his return to the city. But perhaps he had a habit, and his habit had outrun it. "No, Gin, I'm grieving." Then it all came out, how lonely he was without his girls. For not only had he lost Peg, but his younger daughter, Anna, had been taken away from him and was now living in England with our brother Gerald. He said he felt utterly friendless and bereft in New York. It was too much for him. He couldn't stand to be by himself in the loft any more. Could he come live with me for a while? I had thought this might be what he was after. I wanted to say yes, but something prevented me. And I think it was connected to this intuition, or intimation rather, that he had drifted far from civilization's ambit down in Port Mungo and had much to conceal from me. But it broke my heart, him coming to me in need, and me prepared to give much, but not everything, no. I had to keep some distance from him, and I said this. I'd sort him out if he wanted me to, but I couldn't have him in the house. "You can't have me in the house." The way he said it, I might have been speaking to a dog. "No." He nodded. He accepted it without argument. I think he heard it in my tone, and understood that I was not the compliant, adoring, uncomplaining sister I had been once. And he said yes, that was just what he needed, a good sorting out, and he grinned at me, which created such creasing and cleaving in the taut flesh of his bony head that I realised he hadn't grinned at anyone in quite some time. It warmed me to see it, and I grinned back. And there we were, Jack and Gin, just like old times. We got drunk and talked about Peg, also about Vera Savage, the painter, the mother of his girls. He wept a little, and I did my best to comfort him. The depth of his emotion impressed me, but he had squandered much of his strength and had few resources left with which to cope with his grief. We parted warmly, and with various resolutions made. I told him to go straight home, no drifting about in the night. He said he would. I didn't altogether trust him. Jack's will, once roused, was fierce, but he was weak, and he was drunk, and drink undoes the will like nothing else. But when I got to Crosby Street the next morning, he was clear-eyed and alert, having slept, so he told me, better than he had in months. I was gratified to know I had some influence over him still. Nobody else could have turned him from the trajectory he was on, even if I did apparently suffocate him. So we got the loft organised. We put his work table in some sort of order, and talked about what he wanted to do. All rather dark and bleak, his ideas, but this was not the point. Work itself was what he needed, and if his brief season in what he regarded as hell was the engine of fresh creativity, then so be it. I left guardedly confident that he was once more on course. I visited him again the next day, and for several days after that, and I saw him steadily resuming his old habits.